Okay, so that was about a 22-minute film clip, and I'm learning to turn off the camera and just start over because the camera will just turn off. The next category that I'd like to speak with you about is traumatic brain injury, or students with TBI. Sometimes it's referred to as TBI. We should be familiar with TBI, at least in our culture, because so many of our military service members from the last 20 years have experienced traumatic brain injuries because of the way war is being conducted. And we, I think, talked about this in another class, in our crisis class. But for children, traumatic brain injury usually occurs from an accident or being in a severe car accident, perhaps a fall, maybe a sports injury. Very few of these students have the origination of their injury coming from abuse, physical abuse from a caregiver. Shaken baby syndrome, you might know about that. If it's very severe, could result in a traumatic brain injury. But what happens in the traumatic brain injury is that the brain is because of sudden movement, is being banged around basically inside the skull. And the level of the injury and the impairment is really dependent on how awful that jarring around inside the skull was. And so we're going to talk about levels of TBI in a second here. So you'll remember from the beginning of my lecture that I talked about Roddy, the boy who was in a car accident. And he's an example of someone with a traumatic brain injury. And I might just turn to that page and read a little bit more with you about Roddy in terms of what he needs. So let me just go to that page. It's page 416. And this is interesting to me. Roddy's mother speaks for her interest in what she wants him to be able to accomplish. So in part 2 of the IEP, it says Roddy's mother's priorities are that, number 1, he be treated well by other students. That's her first interest in him. And so she's hoping for social inclusion of some sort. The second thing she'd like him to do is to continue to learn life skills. Remember when I described him earlier, part of the description states that last year, during the school year, he learned to put on his jacket. That is one huge task that this young boy learned in terms of self-care. Given his excellent progress this year in learning to put on his jacket, that is mentioned in part 2. And then number 3 is her interest in his being able to be taught reading. Where am I reading? Roddy has expressed an interest in trying out the cafeteria. Currently, he eats in his special education classroom with only 5 other students present. So I won't read more of this right now, but this lets us see the kinds of goals that a parent might have for a child with a traumatic brain injury. They aren't so concerned that this child is going to learn to write a term paper, because this child will never write a term paper. They're really more interested in this child learning to be able to discern which bathroom is the men's bathroom and which bathroom is the women's bathroom. They want them to be able to read words that are very important for them, maybe to be able to learn to use money to pay for something or to put a coin in a vending machine, as we heard earlier. Let's see. TBI generally can affect a child's all kinds of cognitive functionings. So when you think about how our brain functions and which parts of our brain are responsible for different functions, these are the ways that TBI has impairment for children. It can impair attention, their cognition or thinking patterns, certainly memory, reasoning, judgment, problem solving, and several more. This is, just kind of a short list of the ways that these children have impairment. And also, I'm using the word child because we're talking about children in this class, but people with traumatic brain injury often have problems of the same sort, of course, even if they're adults. The most common TBI is what's called a closed head injury, And as I mentioned to you before, if you imagine maybe a child riding his bike and he maybe was on a big hill and he lost control of his bike and he crashed into a brick wall with his head, you can imagine the amount of jarring force that might have happened to that child. And so, you know, that if the skull is not pierced, if the wound is not open, then this would be referred to as a closed head injury. And then I'll speak with you in a moment about the levels of injury that a person might experience. I didn't write this in my notes, but there are people who have traumatic brain injury from an open head injury where the skull has actually been crushed in a place, and you know, then you get into all kinds of possibilities there with maybe the dura, which is the thick sort of skin-like membrane over the skull. Maybe that's punctured, or maybe some fragments of the skull get pushed into brain tissue. Those sorts of things can happen with an open head injury. But the most common one is a closed head injury. And what happens is that this kind of fierce jarring or banging of the you know, the brain inside our skull can actually tear nerve fibers and axons, as you would have learned about, you know, axons in our Psych 150 class. And these are the messenger, you know, pathways for brain signals to be, what do I want to say? For brain signals to complete themselves in our thinking patterns. So when these things are sheared or torn, all those connections are gone. And you know, we have learned that our brain is much more plastic, has plasticity, if you will, in the sense that it can have some regeneration of functionality, but this tearing or shearing of nerve fibers is what causes all of these damages to functioning areas of the brain. So for example, if that happened in the parietal lobe of our brain, and specifically in Wernicke's area of the brain where our speech center is, then a person is going to have difficulty producing speech, and they may have just complete aphasia, or you know, be able to only make sounds but not have any memory of how to put together a phrase or a sentence. So the types of traumatic brain injuries that can occur, there are three that we'll talk about. One is a concussion, and we've heard about concussions. We hear that, you know, just in our general world, that someone maybe had a fall or a sports injury particularly and has a concussion. And this is when the, you know, it's a mild brain injury, and a person might be unconscious for a brief period of time, maybe a minute, 5 minutes, up to 30 minutes, without, and then there are some complications, but no real brain damage. So the person can, from this injury, experience post-concussion syndrome, which will have some temporary effects like headaches, maybe some dizziness and fatigue, but then these, after a period of time, kind of clarify and go away. So it's not a permanent injury, a concussion. A contusion is when it happens, and the injury causes bruising in the brain or swelling or bleeding in the brain. This is still actually referred to as a moderate brain injury. And in this way, the person experiences significant cognitive or behavioral impairments for many, many months. But most people, even with contusions, will make a complete or a near complete recovery. So these two categories, concussion and contusions, don't meet the description that we have of the student named Roddy. Roddy had a severe head trauma, and his injuries, he did make really good progress in gaining back mobility, for example, and use of his gross muscles to do something like put on a jacket or feed himself. But some of his injuries will never be repaired. So in a severe head trauma, the person is going to be in a coma, and that could be for some period of time, maybe days, weeks, several weeks or maybe even longer. And this can sometimes, be the result of a terrible forced fall or any kind of injury that I've been describing to you earlier. And in this way, these students have pretty profound injuries, and lose a lot of brain functioning. The characteristics of these kinds of students, this information is coming to you from pages 402 and 403 of your text. I'm just going to turn back to it to remind myself about those pages. So this is the characteristics in general of students with these low incidence disabilities. So here again, we're going to go through each one of these categories. And it's a really heterogeneous group. We have to remember this, that of all the groups of special education children, this group has the most variance in it. And almost each student is really just kind of a universe unto herself. But here are some basic characteristics. Most have significant intellectual deficits. Significant intellectual deficits. Remember, we talked about the IQ levels here. The majority of these students have more than one disability, and usually this more than one disability, they're both fairly severe. Most of them are non-ambulatory, so not able to get themselves around without some kind of assistive device or technology. And many of these students might have just basic alertness, consciousness levels that are very compromised. So I didn't go into great detail in my notes with this, but if you look at it, I'm not sure what page it's on. It might be on page 404, but this refers to students who are awake, but they might be not very alert. They might be mostly drowsy or mostly vaguely intellectually or cognitively active. So they might be alert but very inactive. There are all these levels of kind of consciousness that these students might exhibit each day. And so as a person who thinks about educating, I would definitely want to know and learn my student to find out when they're most alert. When are they most able to have the energy to do the little bit of learning each day that we're going to do? So, this alertness level issue is something that is important for the educator to pay attention to. They have slow acquisition of new skills. And so as we studied earlier in this class when we were together face to face, maybe when we were talking about intellectual disabilities, students who are on the very, very low end of this are going to learn really slowly. And as we did a task analysis long ago in our work in the classroom, teachers who are working with these students have to break down tasks into very, 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 very specific and small steps. And then those small steps have to be practiced over and over and over and over and over. So this learning I'm hoping you're getting from me is very slow. So they're going to learn fewer skills, and they have really extreme difficulty learning abstract concepts. So, excuse me, this makes me think about how important it is to be very intentional about what it is you want this child to be learning in your classroom. Or if you were a parent, or a parent who has a child like this, they're not going to have this huge body of learning. And so then we have to decide what things are most important for them to learn. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in this chapter. Once they learn a new skill, it does not get generalized to other settings very quickly. So, for example, if you are teaching a child how to roll a ball, as you might with an infant, or certainly with a toddler, let's say you're rolling a small blue ball in your living room, and then you are ending up at the park and you're on a blanket and you're with some other friends and they have their babies, and somebody brings a big pink ball, your infant is going to remember the ball rolling, if you will, as a construct, and the child will go ahead and push that ball across the blanket because they've already pushed a different ball and they remember doing it. Well, with these children, they won't have this generalized usage of something that they've learned. So you can imagine this concept of generalization is huge in terms of, you know, maybe you're teaching your child to make a grunting sound if they want something and make an eek sound when they don't want something. Okay, so you teach them that and then they use that in the family home. Let's say that's a communication tool. But then when that child gets to school, they won't remember to use that communication set of tools without being coached and prompted and taught in this new environment. And so this is really an important thing to remember too about this type of student. They have limited communication skills. Some cannot talk. They might not even be able to gesture very meaningfully, but that might be something that we want to teach this child to do. Some of these children who have profound mobility issues might really only be able to use their eyes to cut their eyes over in one direction for yes and the other direction for no. And so I hope you're getting the idea here about sort of the, I don't want to be negative, but the limited nature of their learning tasks and the limited nature in this category of discussion of being able to communicate. They aren't going to be children who are probably going to learn full sentences and speak full sentences. Some will, but many, many, many of them will not. Almost all of them have impaired motor development. Let me check the camera again. Yeah, good. So impaired motor development, I spoke about that a little bit earlier. They have very limited physical mobility. They may have, you know, musculature that's very flaccid and fluid, or their muscles might be very jerky, like a child with cerebral palsy, for example. Many of these students can't walk, they can't stand, they might not be able to sit up without being strapped into a chair so that they're sitting upright and not falling forward. Some of these students really have difficulty holding up their head. They probably have few skills in self-care and self-help. So, wow, just imagine anything that I said in the last 2 minutes. And how is this child going to ambulate themselves to be able to sit on a toilet, or to wipe their behinds, or to wash themselves in a bathtub, or even sit up safely in a bathtub or a shower? So you can see how, you know, functional skills are very important to learn and it would help a child such as this to feel more independent and to feel less like a baby and more like a 12th grader, right? They may not have had much social contact outside of their family and outside of school. So these are kids whose parents might be fearful to have them go to someone's house for a birthday party. And the parent might just wish so much that their child would be invited to go to that birthday party. But this child is probably not going to be invited to birthday parties. They are probably not going to be part of a scout troop. They are probably not going to be on a swim team. Many of the other categories of children that we've talked about in these chapters are kids who could participate in those kinds of community activities. This sort of child, it would be really challenging for them to participate. I don't want to say they shouldn't or that they can't, but you can imagine the kind of support that this child would need to be able to go along, for example, on a scout trip to the fire station. They definitely would need to have an aide or their parent with them to get them to these places and safely. So they need caregiving that is very specifically trained and specialized for safety, as you can imagine. Another piece of this for these children is that many of them do not really engage in trying to get the attention of someone. So if you can imagine not being able to speak, but you can make some tiny sounds, but your breathing is very shallow because you're not strongly developed in your lungs, and you're blind, and you're deaf, how are you going to know that someone is in the room with you? And how are you going to get the attention of someone else in the room with you? How are you going to do that? You know, if you're being taught to use your hand or to reach out and then to use the surface of another person's hand to say words through Braille or through finger spelling, then you could do that just by reaching your hand out. But these things have to be taught to the child, because otherwise the child just doesn't have enough sensory input to know when and how to engage a person. So this is, I hope you're hearing this, how interesting and really kind of how profound this level of impairment is. Some of these children, because of their low sensory stimulation, right, or their low sensory input, some of them do engage in ritualistic behaviors that can look a little bit to me like autistic behaviors. So they might do some rocking, they might hum to themselves or make audible sounds that are really meaningless. They're not word sounds, but or they might repeat nonsense sounds. And it is wondered and thought that maybe they do this because they have such low stimulation coming from, outside of themselves. Some of these children do have behavior problems, and they engage in self-injurious or aggressive outbursts. And if you read, I think I remember the first couple of pages in this chapter where there's a special ed teacher who describes her classroom and the work that she does with children. She talks about a child that has angry outbursts and aggressive outbursts, and how that's really the first thing that she has to learn to teach this child to control. And so she uses learning theory, really, reinforcement and negative reinforcement to shape this child's behavior so that the child can even function in any kind of an environment. So these social and communication issues are pretty important factors for these kinds of kids. I think I might stop the camera now and start another clip